Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm coming at you from the road. I am in Kansas right now. We played a show last night in Denver. Played Kansas tonight. We forgot to record a intro for this podcast, so you're getting a little behind the scenes. We're about to do a VIP here in Kansas. Awesome shows this weekend. Thanks to everybody who came out. This week's guest is a huge one for us, somebody who I look up to, somebody who I've just really loved getting to know, and he is so smart. He's one of the only people that talks faster than me. Jefferson Bethke's on the podcast this week. Check it out. Get into it. Make sure to subscribe and tag us on all the socials at Why Are We Here podcast. And, check it out. Let us know what you think. Love you guys. Get into it. Why are we here?
Well, I'm stoked, man. This is fun. Thanks for having me.
Dude, of course. I've been dying to just
like that
chat because me too. I feel like we, have mutual friends. We've chatted a couple times. We've hung out a couple times, but I just love everything you do, and I've been following you on socials now for a couple years, and I love watching your family. I love the books that you put out. So I was like, I just got to get Bethke on here, talk his little ear off, and then we had to bring in other Jeff, which is Jeff Cherry. If you're listening at home, and that's kind of our mutual connection. I'll open it to either of the Jeffs. What is the story of how you guys know each other and how you work together? And then I guess I'll fill in the back end, and it will just give everyone the context they need of why us three are on this chat right now.
Well, long story short, for those who don't know, Jeff is your manager, which I'm guessing they know. Long story short, Jeff basically, upgraded from the minor leagues to the big leagues. So I was the minor league. So he was taking me around places, making sure I didn't die. We're checking in at Motel 6s with bulletproof glass. He's answering emails. We almost did die a couple times. That's a story for another podcast. And then, like I said, he got called up to the big leagues. The name's Spencer Crandall. So then he just moved on. He moved on and he said, see you later over in Maui. No, I'm joking, but Jeff's the best. He was best man at my wedding, good friend. And then, very similar to what he does for you, was doing for me. And he's just a legend.
Yeah, Jeff, you guys were in bunk beds, correct? When this whole shenanigans began, yes. So you had,
it's like one of the only times I've ever met Bethke's dad. He came over and built bunk beds for us, and then we went and had teriyaki lunch together. Yeah,
he said 2 words. But they had to be custom built though, because we lived in a house with 10 guys, I think, or 11 guys, something like that.
That's right.
And we lived in the basement, and the basement was one of those 6-foot ceiling, maybe 7. I mean, I know that I was pretty close, and I'm 5'9", 5'10", so maybe it's probably 7 feet. But anyways, so we had to build custom bunk beds because any normal bunk bed would have put Jeff squished up to the ceiling, because he was on top bunk. And even after we custom built it, even after we custom built it, we almost thought about making a human pizza peel that could slide him in and then pull him out and then put him out, because it was so skinny up there, man.
Like a little drawer, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Well, for those,
I remember
hit it.
I was gonna say, just because it was on TV the other day, when I had never seen the movie Step Brothers, when we did that, and everyone would come in our room and say they would say there's so much more room for activities in here. I'm like, why does everyone say that?
No, neither of us did.
I didn't know.
Yeah, neither of us did.
No, and so everyone would come in and be like, we love the bunk beds, and I'm like, man, everyone says they're all talking about all the activities we can do. I don't get it.
Yes, thankfully they didn't crash in, but yes, neither of us knew that reference, and everyone started saying it. This is so weird.
I can never watch Step Brothers the same again without thinking of Jeff's. But
exactly.
The journey started kind of for you two working together. Bethke, you had super viral video turn into a book deal. Now you are a New York Times bestselling author. You live in Maui, and you're doing the dang thing. Your recent book is Take Back Your Family. That was September, correct?
That's right. It's the green one right there, baby.
It's the green one.
Right there.
On the shelf. Like I said, I think a big reason I wanted to have you on the show, I was thinking about it today, is one of my big dreams is to be a dad. And I always think about it, and I'm like, okay, I'm 26, I'm single, I don't even have, a girlfriend or anything, but one of my big dreams is to be a dad. And so reading some of your book, listening to some of those podcasts that you're doing kind of around the book, I was super intrigued the way that you talk about building a family, building a team. Something I was super interested in, and maybe this was the fuel for the book, was that you called the Western vision of family a failed experiment. Maybe talk about that, and is that because of individualism? Is that because of Christianity being taken out of the home? What do you feel like that is, and what sparked the book?
Solid question, and this one we could probably go on for hours in some sense, and I'd love to hear your pushback or your thoughts. But yeah, I mean, I think so the premise of the book is I try to open up with this concept that, and this is actually at any level, almost all of my books, just because it's kind of how my brain thinks. I like to pull things apart and kind of be like, well, we're all doing this, but this seems very strange that we're all doing this, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so this one is kind of like carved that with family, where I kind of just realized, okay, in the West, 21st century, probably post-industrial revolution, but definitely like World War II and on, we're one of the most prosperous countries that's ever lived, right? We have all of the resources available to us. I mean, even the fact that like you can, I want to say this carefully, even the fact you can even be single in the modern world is that's luxurious. That shows the prosperousness of our country and our world. Because I mean, you go back to 1,000 years ago, if you were not tied to a family line and you weren't in like a 4 or 5 generation team that had cattle and land and, some type of, blacksmith craft or whatever it is, you couldn't survive, like you literally wouldn't be able to live. Like you couldn't, basically you could not survive out there on your own just because of the lack of resources. Now, it's a massive blessing, right? It's a massive blessing that we have that privilege. So that was kind of the premise of the book, because I get into a lot more of that. Just basically saying like, hey, with all those blessings, the most prosperous, we have all the resources, we have every book at our fingertips, we have every expert at our fingertips, we can watch YouTube videos and listen to podcasts all day. Why are our families actually trending the opposite way in direct correlation with these things growing? So it's like prosperity's growing, right? Modernity's growing, technology innovation's growing, and yet our families are, the divorce rate gets higher every single year. People born into kind of like more impoverished circumstances has grown. Fatherlessness is a huge one that actually keeps growing and is continuing to do so. So I kind of was just saying like, hey, let's look at this data. And kind of like what's going on. And that's essentially what the second half of the book is like, is there something actually about, this is my thesis, is there something actually about the Western way in which we live, which I do zoom in pretty heavily. I don't say it's the only factor, but I do zoom in pretty heavily on individualization, kind of like the individual being paramount. Now, this is a sticky conversation because, I'm actually thankful for what the West has done for individuals, going all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. You go back before there in regards to English common law. So you probably about 400-ish years, the individual has began to be protected, honored, rights, and all these different types of things that I'm thankful for, but there's something sticky in there where we've no longer made it about rights for an individual to enter into society, and now it's just like it's almost more about meeting the desires of the individual, and anything that hinders that must be wrong. And I just kind of talk about, I don't talk about in society, even though I think there's a correlation there, but in the family, I think that can be really detrimental because it becomes a massive tug of war, and it becomes a massive, you then start treating your family as your enemy rather than your team, because they're actually going to take more money and resources and time and energy from you, and on and on. But like I said, I can do a 45-minute talk on that topic, but that's what I would say right there.
It was super interesting, just because I feel like you're calling into question, it was a huge pendulum swing before, especially if you look at, like you said, before Industrial Revolution and all those kinds of things. Big families living together, relying on each other. I mean, you're having kids and they're lifting up the farm, and then you take care of the elders that live in the house. Now it's like the second you're engaged, you're having your own family unit, and it's about consumption. I heard you talking about, gosh, I'm kind of losing it, but it's like this thing post Sears.
That was my favorite part of the book.
Can you talk about that? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So and I was even with a buddy the other day, and he was even saying, he was like, man, you have the weirdest stories in your books, but they kind of connect to something fun. Yeah, and that was my favorite part of the book personally. Meaning when I discovered that, I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. So you a lot of people don't realize this, but Sears, it was actually called Sears and Roebuck Co. back in the day. I mean, they were the 1900s Amazon. So early 1900s, they had catalogs that weighed, I think, like 4 pounds. They were mailed across the world, and just everything was bought through Sears mail catalog. That'd be epic if it was online. But so, you would call in, you would send in your order, you would pick the things and all that stuff. But it got so large, Sears basically started doing ridiculous levels of scope in regards to their thing. And so then what they started doing is they kind of, at the peak and height of their massiveness, they started doing homes, meaning like you could buy a kit home, like literally a home that would show up, and no help would come with it, but it would show up with like a manual, just like when you buy like a board game or something at Toys R Us. It would show up with a manual and instructions, and it would be a container. So they would drop off a container, like the back of a semi-truck at the front of your house. There would usually be a wax seal on the back as kind of like a proof that like this has not been touched, no one has messed with this yet. Kind of that fresh opening, you know what I mean? And literally there was just a house in there. There's a house in there, and I think there's something like 80 to 100,000 homes in the Midwest, which is a lot, by the way, that have been built via the Sears like early 1900s mail kits. It's just fascinating, by the way. It also shows you like I couldn't do that. Like people were just beasts back then, by the way.
I was thinking the same thing. I was like, how in the world?
Yeah, like a mail, and now again, everything, you didn't have to cut, everything was literally done, but still that scale, like a home, and these homes are still standing, they're still gorgeous, they're still being sold and bought and all that stuff. And we didn't know this for a long time, by the way. It got lost in like the legend, and then there was these couple people that just went down this rabbit hole of realizing that and tried to discover them, and they made, I think it's a nonprofit, but they made an entire organization just knocking on people's doors in the Midwest and then saying something akin to like, can I go look at your basement? Because the beams would have a stamp on the basement floor to prove that it was a Sears home. Anyways, what I talk about in the book that's fascinating though is if you actually get into the boardroom of Sears when they made that call, it was actually them trying to disrupt the multi-generational family so that they could make more money. And so what I talk about is, again, this is similar to anything we live at in this world. You have to always question the motives behind why we made this shift. Why are we in this point? A lot of us just say like, oh, we don't live multi-generationally because we don't want to, or our in-laws would be annoying, or whatever, right? And there's some people should not, by the way, so that's very clear. Let's say that. But I think it's fascinating to know one of the primary forces that actually forced us to split off generationally and start living one generation in a home was actually basically a capitalistic company. Like they basically were running out of customers. They were saying like we want people to buy these homes, but everyone just keeps living with like their grandma and grandpa, and then they build a little wing maybe on the next to the shed or whatever. Yeah. And they were like, oh, I have an idea. Let's actually invent the need, which is a classic capitalist thing, right? It's like no one has certain needs, and then you invent these needs, and then now everyone feels like, oh, I have to have this thing, when it's like 2 minutes ago you didn't want that thing. Yeah. But that's exactly what happened. They basically said, and if you go look at the early advertisements, I wanted to put some of them in my book, but the publisher, for rights reasons, we couldn't. They're basically catering to like newlyweds. They're kind of saying, don't you, like kind of American dream, don't you want to live on your own? I know it would be so tough, but now that we're here, you can do it on your own. You can build your own house. Fascinating, right? And so I just kind of poke around on that and say that's very interesting, that's one of the main reasons why we don't do that anymore, rather than just like some other reason.
Yeah, that reminds me, I heard a long time ago that like eggs and bacon wasn't a breakfast thing for a very long time. And maybe around that same time, it was like poultry and egg companies were like, we need sales. So what we're going to do, we're going to make this big commercial. And it's like the American breakfast, eggs and bacon. And now if you go anywhere, that's what you order. It's like the American breakfast. They made this need. They're like, this is who you are. It's the storytelling, which is really interesting. Especially, 100%. I think about this all the time. Companies just don't have your best interest at heart. And so I think what you're calling into question is, who does have your best interest in heart? What is the best interest for your family? And what does that look like? Something that you talked about is kind of like legacy and storytelling for your family. I thought that was really interesting. Would love to talk to you about kind of like building the mythology, building the culture, building the story of your family, and how important is that to you and your family? Maybe even some examples of stuff that you guys do. Yeah,
no, that's a great question. And I'd even love to hear Jeff on this one, because I think his family is actually a great example of this, where they the way they tell stories, the way they kind of connect in like an old tribal way. And I mean that, I'm not saying that like his dad's, marching around the fire in like a tiki. I mean, amazing if Lloyd was doing that. Don't put it past him. Lloyd, I could see, especially with the coconut bra, I could see Lloyd with the coconut bra on the TV thing, just dancing around the fire. Lloyd, if you're watching this, just cut that out, pretend I didn't say it. But his family does a really good job at this, and I've seen it in person. But yeah, there's, again, so you go, before the internet, how did you get, you can use a bunch of different words for this, but I would say, how did you get wisdom? Meaning, like, how did you get answers that were actually like kind of hard fought, and you couldn't, maybe a little bit before internet, books, okay, but even before then, how did you get wisdom? Now, the answer for all of human history was usually grandparents, or elders is sometimes a word that they would use in the tribe culture. Elders, right? Meaning, like, these people have lived 70, 80, 90 years, and they've learned a bunch of lessons. And in tribal culture specifically, it's the most obvious, where they almost spend that last season of their life, the last 10 to 30 years of their life, saying, okay, my job now is only to teach, mentor, and pass on. And even the scriptures, by the way, you know what I mean? Like, I'm a Christian. I know not everyone probably listening is, but I love the scriptures. One of the fascinating parts about the Torah, which would be the first 5 books of the Bible, is that was an oral tradition first. So you're going to engage with that book differently when, so many people in the West read it like a science book, right? When it's like, this is an old, ancient, like archaic Jewish scrolls that were written and put down while listening after hundreds of years to oral tradition. Right, it's kind of the recording of the oral tradition.
I mean, sometimes it wasn't a long time, like rabbinical traditions, like 30 to 100 years before anything gets written down. It's all just telling people what you've been through.
Totally. And what's interesting too is there's something about the West where I don't know what it is, but we think that oral tradition is like weaker, if that makes sense, than written down. When that's just not the case, right? Like there was a reason that like Jewish Hebrew 12-year-olds could memorize the entire first 5 books of the Bible, is because they were raised in an oral tradition. Like I don't know one child that could do that, in the West right now. And so it actually was like really deeply formative to the brain, is what I'm saying. Oral tradition, it changed how you see the world, changed your senses. Anyways, what I was saying is with that, we've lost that art with our families. And so, one example I give is, it's storytelling and kind of connecting to legacy is super, super powerful. So powerful that almost every single business knows that and does it itself, right? Mm-hmm. So you go into, I'm a massive Chick-fil-A fan. Maybe some people aren't. Politics aside, I'm just saying that chicken sandwich is fire, or gas, as the new kids like to say.
Yeah.
Exactly. But it's so good. And so you go into almost any Chick-fil-A. And on the walk to the bathroom, I've seen it like a million times now, and it's always a little different, there's usually this this arc or this timeline, and it'll say like 1952 with a picture of like, what is it, Truett Cathy was the first one, or Dan Cathy, and then it'll go 1974, we opened 5 stores, and in 1980, it's like, and what it's doing is it's storytelling. And I doubt that every single day that manager is taking the employees over to there and say, memorize our story, but there's something about if you just constantly infuse your environment with a bigger story than yourselves, right? It does something really deeply to you. And there's actually sociology to support that too, that the more you know about your grandparents and your great-grandparents and the legacy that has kind of already died off behind you, the more likely you are to be mentally and socially healthy. That's a fascinating statistic.
That is interesting.
Right? But I think what it does is it's like, because it's so easy to get mentally in a wreck, if you might say, if you're so just like, my life is for me. My life is about me. My life, you know what I mean? And we're not like, a lot of us are not trying to say that intentionally, but when you start carving a life where you're hearing no stories except for that, and then you turn on the TV or you get on your phone and all the messaging is saying that and support, like when everything's supporting that, then it's going to do that. But yeah, I think practically, last thing I would say is just, I encourage a lot of dads out there, especially young dads, even if you maybe don't get along with the upper generation, just rope them in for storytelling, because that storytelling is actually like the olive branch of peace. Meaning, like, sure, you don't want to get into an argument with your parents about, politics or this or that or whatever if you disagree with them. But you start asking them just stories of their childhood, and it's crazy how that just washes away so much angst in them, angst in you, and it just connects you and softens everything. But yeah, Jeff, I feel like you guys do this so well. Anything specific on this or what you would say? But I feel like Lloyd's got stories for days.
Yeah, the thing with I think it's been interesting to watch because Jeff, I think that you didn't necessarily grow up in the traditional family setting. Like, it was a lot more individualistic because you and your mom were just fending for yourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I've had a sideline view of you kind of processing and figuring this out for yourself as you started a family and said, what do I want this to look like for me and Alyssa and our kids? And you're making those decisions in real time. And for me, it was never something that was defined. My dad didn't sit us down and say,
exactly,
we this is how we're gonna do this, and it just happened. We had dinner every single night around the dinner table, and that's where my dad asked us questions about what happened at school, or he told us a story about a relative, and still to this day, when my dad and I go fishing or something. These are the things that we give my dad a hard time about at times, but it really is that on display. We'll be out fishing in the middle of nowhere, and he's just Jeff, I feel like today I should tell you about your Aunt Agnes. And I'm just like...
Agnes, is that for real? Is that a real aunt name?
No.
I was like, that's too good to be true if her name was Agnes.
He'll just start telling me about a relative, and he'll tell me, like, what they went through and why they moved, or, like, why they got away from the thing they were pursuing and how they ended up doing the job that they were doing and how they met their spouse and, like, where they had kids and, like, you know, all those things. Like, my grandparents, for instance, like both my grandpas, but my dad's dad was in the military, and he was getting stationed in Alaska. And so, like, he had only known my grandma for a very short time, but they got married so that they could live together and move up to Alaska. And they took my grandma's sister because they needed a witness. And, like, in the state of Washington, you couldn't get a marriage license in under, like, 3 days. So they drove to Idaho because you could get it the same day. And took Aunt Dewey.
That's a story right there.
So that they could get married, so they could take
Spencer's
off.
about to write a song about that right now. I said, going over to Idaho to get that wedding certificate.
Jeff, you can't spoil the next single, dude. What are you doing?
That's my bad. Exactly. But exactly what you're saying right now, like, that stuff forms you.
Yeah. And my dad's been super intentional. Like, we've been doing yard work, and he would sit me down on the front porch while we had a drink to take a break, and he would just, like, I need to teach you about this today.
Yeah.
And he would just, and it was like, it wasn't anything ever written down. It, you know, it was just, I'm going to share this information with you. My dad is very thoughtful, and he's very intentional, and he is very sentimental. So he really values our family and those stories, and wants, you know, sees the importance in us knowing where we come from.
I love that. And then it goes against, it rubs against the definition of foolishness too, because I'm actually researching my next book right now, and I was on this little trail about foolishness. And foolishness at some level can be defined as basically just making all these mistakes because you've never paid attention to anyone before you, essentially. It's like a nicer way of saying that. And to me, that's where this, you're kind of like, you're almost having either a grandparent, a grandma, a grandpa, or even like mentors, by the way, even older people. You're kind of, when you engage with that connection of the different generations, you're kind of having them go before you and pull out these little landmines as you're walking. You know what I mean? And that's just so beneficial. And I think we've lost that art for sure.
Yeah, we had a thing on our fridge that my mom literally printed out called the Crandall Creed. This is real.
That's legit.
And it was
Did y'all get tats? Did y'all get tats with it?
Not yet. We'll see if Sherry gets tatted. We'll get her blasted. But it was literally like, now I'm thinking about this. I'm like, oh, this is exactly what it was. It's storytelling for your family. Yep. We are this. The Crandalls, if you're in a situation, you're wondering who you are, come back to this. You are kind. You are humble. You are, I mean, it was these incredible, and we used to roast her about it because we're like, oh, I guess that one's not on the Crandall Creed. But now as I'm older, you understand how the storytelling of you are a part of this tribe, even if it's little, even if it looks different than other people's, and we do this and we believe in this. And so I think it builds towards something that's bigger than yourself. And I think that's what your book kind of pointed to in a beautiful way is there's a difference between a family like achieving and versus a family like every kid is happy with quotes versus serving each other and creating a culture of like long-term legacy, generational wealth, even wealth is in like happiness and kindness and all those kinds of things. And I just thought it was beautiful. I heard you say something too about how like it's really interesting about how peak humanity in society's eyes is like the 22-year-old bro at Planet Fitness, cryptocurrency, hustle culture, just kind of your other book as well. I would love to hear kind of the marriage of those two things of like, one, to hell with the hustle, and two, like, how does that play into your family? Something I think about, maybe I'll frame it this way. I love my work and I love working really hard. One of my bigger fears is, am I going to be the dad who puts his career first? Am I going to be the dad who just doesn't have enough time or is bitter or resentful towards my kids because I didn't get to live my dreams or I'm not living my dreams to the full capacity? And maybe how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think which part I want to go back. Yeah, let's talk about that end part you just talked about. I think Yeah, it's really critical, and that it's there is even though I think women can struggle with this, there is data to support that men tend to, at least in our culture, whether you call it because just the culture we're in or because the way men are wired, that we wrestle with this problem a little bit more. That dichotomy of feeling like always torn between kind of like work and kids or work and marriage, work and
Sure.
And it's a real battle, first of all. So I think you have to acknowledge that. I think the one thing I like to tell people, and I talk about this in the book, is it's not even, sometimes you don't even have to change what you do at a base fundamental level. I mean, like, you don't need to change your job once you get married and have kids. Like, take them along for the ride. But what I would say, though, is you do have to shift your perspective, right? If you're going from single to married, you have to almost take the whole family, spouses, both you spouses, the kids, if you have them, blended family, whatever your family looks like, and whatever your unit looks like, you have to kind of, I always like to say, like, pretend that you're the board of directors over the activity of your family. So kind of have like two different roles, right? There's like, and what I mean by that is, like, for me, there's Jeff, the author, Jeff, the podcaster, Jeff, just think of all the activities I do, the work. Mm-hmm. But there's also Jeff, the co-chair of the board of the Bethkes. And I know that's a really weird way to put it, but it's been deeply helpful in our family and other families, because what it does is then, yes, I might still have to go out and do X, Y, and Z, but our family up at the boardroom level has agreed that is my job. Has agreed that I need to go gain resources for this company, right? I need to go bring back, if you're using that metaphor down the road, like, I need to bring back like profit share for like the stockholders, of this company. And so, but what happens is a lot of guys don't, or even men and women in the marriage, they don't have the conversation up here, and then down here it just becomes a tug of war of resources again. It just becomes of like who's going to be a stronger personality to just get the life they want. Sadly, usually the men win that, and so then we have, and I talk about that in the book, where moms moms have gotten like 4 or 5 hits historically the last 150 years that have made that we need to reconcile and rectify. In regards to, every time someone's life has gotten easier, whether it's, kids not having to work on the farm anymore and public education, et cetera, for some weird reason, every time you track one of those, everyone's life got easy and the mom's life got harder. Meaning she has to kind of take on more and take on more. That's a little bit of a side point to this point, but I still think it's worthy of note. So I would just say that, like, if you can elevate, because then what happens is, rather than me saying, like, this is just my job, I'm going to go do what I do, you do have to have some faith, if you want to call it that, or risk, or whatever word you want to use, once you enter into a new stage, to kind of put everything on the table, meaning, okay, now that I'm in this stage of my life, is this the best way for our team to steward and gain and retain resources, to bring them into our family, to bring them into our company? And it's a subtle change, but sometimes it can mean a massive change. And so that's just a helpful thing for us, is we have to see ourselves, okay, we all have roles down here on the team. But up here, quarterly, we have agreed as a company that is what we're trying to do, because everyone's flourishing. So one sign, by the way, that the board needs to make some different decisions is if anyone's sinking. So if the kids are sinking, if the wife is sinking, and if the husband's sinking, then that means, okay, just like any other company, right? Something is going wrong. You should probably change. You might have to fire the CEO. You might have to bring in a consultant, whatever you want to call it. You can use the metaphor as much as you want, but I think that's a really helpful way to think about that team-oriented deployment of all the resources, which is AKA all the humans on the team.
No, I love that, because it kind of made me feel at ease, because I'm like, okay, that is a little easier to understand and a little like less, it's less heavy for me to think of it that way, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Well, the two things that I think of, like, one, I mean, even just a few weeks ago when Bethke and I were in Vermont, we were talking about how they just remodeled a house last year. Yeah. And he was just saying, like, it was not Alyssa's thing. Like, Alyssa she was just overwhelmed with that process, and we had to make some adjustments. Yeah. We had to make some adjustments as a team, because we weren't flourishing together. Yep. And then the other thing that I've seen Jeff do really, really well, like, our friendship has changed so much since we first met, because now, like, if I go to visit,
in high
Jeff
school, we met in high school in like 10th grade. That was even before this. That's crazy.
But like now, like, Bethke doesn't get a break from being a dad. Like, we can be on the beach, we can be out to eat, like, but we don't ever, I mean, when we went to BJ's, like, the three of us didn't just get to have a conversation like nobody else was there, because Cannon and Kinsley were there. Yep. Yeah. And the thing that Jeff does really well is he brings his kids into what he's doing. And I think, Spencer, for you someday, like that's the magic of like, if you want to chase your dream or keep building this thing, because that's part of what you're doing is like you're showing your storytelling to your kids as you do it. Like, this is what we do. We chase our dreams and we work hard, but we don't sacrifice family for it. We invite them into it. And like the number of Instagram stories Bethke has of taking the kids to Home Depot, like that's a way harder errand with 3 kids. But he's like teaching about like, we're going to do this together. We're going to like work on the house together. I'm going to invite you into projects, or like taking Kinsley on fun trips and letting her, I mean, talk about how like you let Kinsley be your travel agent, like when you guys go on trips now.
I know. Yeah, no. And that's actually a great point. And Spencer, you have that opportunity more than, I mean, every job, and I say this in my book, and I put a bunch of examples in my book of 9-to-5 jobs, firemen, whatever it is. We have a whole community of family teams of people figuring this out. So it's not just like the entrepreneur person. I will acknowledge there's a level of easiness to an artist, a creative, an entrepreneur, being able to enfold your kids into that. And so I just tell them, like, don't, but it's sad, by the way, how many still don't. So I'm like, hey, you have one of the dream scenarios to enfold your kids and your family. So why would you not? And our life is similar. But one thing there's actually fascinating research that I just read. It was, of course, it's like I read it after the book, and I'm like so pissed. But there's, it was research on this concept of unconditional love. Right. And now a lot of us, and self-esteem, it was like a sociological longitudinal study on self-esteem and unconditional love. Now, a lot of us, and unconditional love, you do need to have your whole life at some level. But a lot of us think that that's like the main thing we need to give our kids, right? And then by the time, and we just stuff them so much with that, and then all of a sudden teenage years start happening and they start slamming doors and all these, the disconnect, and we're like, you keep giving them unconditional love. Now, they need that, but it's not nearly all they need, and it's certainly not first place, the study found. So the study found from 0 to 4, that is one of the most important things, is that your kids are healthily attached, is another word for that, and that's usually through knowing that they don't, gain or earn anything by, they don't have to do anything for your approval from 0 to 4. That's like the most important thing you can do as a parent. Who cares if you feed them the little Pinteresty, Instagram white mom recipe stuff that they're all sending out? Like, who can feed them Cheez-Its, feed them whatever you do, all the crap, okay? Who cares about all that other dumb stuff that pressures you? But just make sure that they know, get them healthily attached, and make sure they know unconditional love. But after age 4, this was so fascinating, they found that the biggest predictor of self-esteem and emotional health was not actually unconditional love, but it was after 4 years old, it was just contribution to something. Meaning they needed to feel like they had like a purpose, because that's when it starts going inward. When we don't give them that, it starts creating these it kind of coddles kids essentially, and makes them very entitled and very self-centered. But most of us in the West, we do not give our kids kind of a higher purpose or something to contribute to at age 4, right? That's very early. Now it doesn't mean you need to work them to the bone, but I'm just saying they need to have a sense of contribution to something outside of them, is essentially what the research found. And so all that to say, I think that's exactly what Jeff was saying, is why, that's the reasoning of why I do what I do. And I think same with you with music, bring it, like the kids should be running the merch table. The kids should be doing this, with obviously when they can, but stuff like that actually is not just to like enfold them relationally, which is helpful, but it actually that is one of the predictors of mental health and self-esteem, which is fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Well, and I would say like that applies outside of the family too,
any
because
work,
in running like businesses, Brett and I at Happily for a while, like we thought that the best thing we could do is like give all the employees all the snacks they wanted and all the things they requested. And that just led to more disappointment that they didn't have all the stuff that they wanted. But the second that we made like goals, like this is what the company's doing and this is how your work is helping the company accomplish stuff, people were happy. Like that's all they wanted to know, was that their work mattered and that it was contributing to this bigger thing.
100%.
And so I think there's something just in, regardless if it's a family or a team,
anyone wants
as
a higher sense of purpose
as a
and
group
mission.
of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I feel like the saddest or like most anxious that I am is when I feel my disconnect from my why or my purpose. And it probably is no different for a little kid. It's just hard for them to like say that. And they would never tell you.
Yeah, they can't
like,
articulate it.
Exactly. You know what I need, Dad? It's like some more purpose.
I need more purpose in my life. Can I get that for Christmas?
Exactly. Exactly. Do you feel like that is, I guess when you were talking about that, my brain was like, does that mean like family specific purpose, or is it like identity purpose, meaning like I play soccer, I do music, or is it kind of this like all encompassing thing? Because I think my gut said like sports and stuff, but maybe that's like what's wrong with what you're talking about is people putting their identities in like these things.
I do think it's all the above. I think it's all the above. You need to know that you're contributing. Well, another massive factor in kids' emotional health is resilience. So they've done studies on that. The kids that turn out, they kind of give these kids tests, and essentially they judge you on basically two factors. When you encounter a problem that you can't solve, do you start like pulling your hair out, getting really anxious and feeling like you're about to cry? You know, whatever it is, just like kind of like if you start unraveling when you can't figure out the problem, or do you almost, when you encounter the problem, get a twinkle in your eye and be like kind of excited, like, oh, I kind of get to figure this out? That is, they only judge them on that, and literally, and that's they define it as resilience, similar to Angela Duckman's grit stuff, but different. Is that the resilience is like one of the top. You need to teach your kids to be able to have that mentality with anything they encounter, that it's always a problem to figure out, not a wall to like turn around and go home with, for their like actual success of their future. So I think that is really important when you get into some of the sports, music lessons, all that stuff, is that as long as they're having that mentality, and it's actually deeply beneficial. I do think music and sports culture, maybe it's because I have my ear to the ground too much, because that's all we do is talk to other families, and we have thousands and stuff online, is I do think it's a little overwhelming for a lot of families. I think it's a little much. I do think you start getting into the realm of massive weird equilibrium of shame and I can't do it and perform, like, you know what I mean? So they're normally good, but I feel like there's something about, I haven't been able to put my finger on it yet, but I think once they become super high select, and not saying that you shouldn't, go for excellence, there's just something about that culture that is I would almost say toxic. So you can live in a culture that's, and not get toxicity in you. You just have to wear a gas mask. So I don't know what that gas mask is to, in that culture, but I just would say be careful. But I mean, I was like that. I played baseball my life. I loved it. It formed me in a million different ways, played it really seriously. But I also, I feel like it's double-edged sword, see different parts of it. All that to say, I think the core of it is your kids it doesn't need to just be in your family. Your kids need to be contributing to something that's bigger than just one human. This is probably the easiest way I could say it. It kind of needs to be like a collective goal, and that can be business, that can be sports, that can be the family, it can be something with friends. But I think that's the stuff that really starts churning and answering those deep questions in our soul of like, I matter, I'm here for a reason, I have purpose.
Yeah, I love all that, man. I'm so glad that you're here, and I've loved our chat. We like to do a couple like kind of just bigger, we're called Why Are We Here? So we like to ask some big existential questions, and they're kind of weird
with the
or just different. We do. We like to warm you up and then just hit you with the weirdest stuff we got.
Most people end their podcast with like the little like, here's what are your 5 favorite things? And it'll be like chapstick and your favorite movie. I'm like,
to me,
why are we all here?
Podcast, the best part is like, or to me, I guess when I started a podcast, is I would have these chats with my friends in like living rooms, or kind of that like sleepover or 3 a.m. part where you're like, okay, what do you guys think about this? Okay, but what about simulations? What about alien? Whatever. So I like to get into that stuff real quick before I let you go. One thing that this is a question I ask sometimes on this podcast, and you're a guy who I was just fascinated thinking of what your answer would be, was if you could ask God one question, what would that question be?
Oof. That's a very good question. Oh, I probably could think of a million, so it's actually not that I can't think of one. It's more. I mean, I feel like the one is I would as a Christian, I would say the one that is just most challenging for me is the evil and suffering question. Do you know what I mean? That's such a. I do think there's logical answers to that. Theologically, coming from my perspective, I think there's technical answers that are very good, but man, that's a tough one from a heart level, emotional level, sensitivity level, to feel like it can be, that it can be ultimately satisfying. There's a little bit of I don't know, which I actually I'm consigned to that and okay with that. There's a little bit of man, that's I don't know the answer to that question very well, so I would like to ask him that question. But that's a tough one. That's one I would say for sure.
Yeah, that's always my answer to that same question. Is I feel like I get a lot of the other stuff, and even like you're saying, like there's logical reasoning. Well, because free will and so this and this, I get it, but it just hurts. It hurts to think of these terrible things that have happened, and I feel like that is probably the number one answer unfortunately. I feel like for a lot of people, it is their barrier into actually diving into religion, because it feels like the biggest unanswerable, unknowable question. And even like for myself, you know, I grew up, you and I almost have like, not opposite stories, but interesting that like I grew up in a very traditional Christian home. And I feel like you, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't necessarily grow up with a lot of that stuff. And I feel like you in your 20s found all of that and like ran with it and made it your own. I feel like I've been doing the opposite in my 20s of like, you know, like this might be cringy to hear, but like something like deconstruction or like just really looking into a lot of different things, because I feel like it's okay if I put it down on the table, check out everything, and then if I pick it back up, it will mean that much more to me. And that's definitely one of the bigger reasons I always flinch to just go 100% back in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I love that answer too, by the way, and I love your honesty and vulnerability there. And no cringe at all. I think it's there's a weird cultural moment happening for sure in specifically America, because I don't actually see it happening as much in Europe or Australia, some of the other Western countries, of, you know, that word deconstruction. There's now ambiguous is the wrong word. I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted because I there's some stuff that I love about it, meaning like there is the thing that really bothers me about the older generation, specifically anyone with some type of religious leadership, is there's a lack of ability to question. There's a lack of ability to poke and prod and kind of peel back the layers. And my personality is so that person. And I actually, you know what's fascinating is it sounds like me and you are even driven by the same thing. I just maybe have gotten to a different place than you have with those answers, but very driven to what you said of like it has to be all tested before I pick it back up. It has to be all, you know, confirmed at a certain level. I would 100% agree with that. I wish more people actually did that. And that sounds like if we get into the nitty gritty on the weeds of that, that'd be a fun beer conversation for, 9 hours of bourbon is more my thing. But yeah, so but I am conflicted on it though too, because I do think there's a level, I don't actually see this in you at all, just to be clear, but I think there's a zeitgeist, so there's a spirit in the culture of deconstruction that does have a little bit of like burn it all down mentality, which I wrestle with that. I don't think, to me, it's like, I would prefer not to be 30 years from now, standing and living in a house that was seriously needed to be remodeled, but now is just ash. I would like to be able to actually go to bed at night. You know what I mean? I would actually be able to get, and it would have taken it would have taken sometimes even harder work to remodel a house than burn it down. But I do see that in the macro. And so that I get a little nervous sometimes with that spirit, because I don't know what I would call it in me, but maybe it's my personality, maybe it's my drive, maybe it's something, but I'm like, I think there's so much to respect and honor. To me, that's actually the harder, more genuine, mature work is what I'm trying to say, is to say, okay, this part needs to go, but this part, I don't actually even agree with this part, but this part stays. This part stays. Because to me, I'm not trying to have a faith that just looks like me. If I'm just bouncing every single part of it that you know what I mean, that I don't like, and every part that I do like, then it's like, well, then I've just kind of created basically just me. And that's like, God's basically just a bigger version of me. And so that's a pretty serious existential question, by the way, of like, do I see God like me? Is there anything that God and me would disagree on?
I think about this all the time, though, so I'm so glad you're talking about it, because I'm like,
totally.
Am I going to be the guy who genuinely builds, picks and kind of Frankensteins together my beliefs? Or can you be convicted about something and be confused by it? And this is where I think you and I are similar, where it's like, it just drives me nuts to not test drive the whole car. Like, I really want to make sure the backup camera works. I want to make sure all these things work. And so I always get to this point, I'm like, I should just go back into that thing that I loved and it made me comfortable and all these things. But then I always hesitate. I always kind of balk, because I'm like, but what about this thing that I read? What about this stuff? And so now what I'm trying to do, and this is, off of the question now, but is decide basically, okay, is it worth not doing the thing at all and always being the guy who's like, but see, I know stuff and I am always searching. Totally. Is that good? Yeah. Which there's some good in it, or am I the guy who can eventually, the word is faith, And it is tough. Can you dive in even though you don't have all the answers? And that's just where I am. And that's why I love talking to guys like you, because you're a little bit ahead in life, which I think is awesome. Like Jeff and you are in that kind of mentor stage for a guy like me. And so I just wanted to pick your brain about that kind of stuff, because I was like, when else am I going to have that opportunity?
Yeah. No, I love this conversation. I mean, G.K. Chesterton, if you're familiar with him, or early 1900s writer, I think he was Catholic, maybe, I can't remember exactly his tradition, but one of those kind of like C.S. Lewis, brilliant, can actually like hang with anyone in regards to philosophical questions that some of his books I can't even read because they're too intense.
Sure.
But one of his really simple quotes was, an open mind is like an open mouth. Sooner or later, it's meant to close on something. And I think if we always, I do think that's an interesting, I would say, I wouldn't give it any more word than that. I think it's an interesting dynamic of modern culture today, that there's almost like a open-mindedness has become more about sometimes the signal it gives rather than actually the authentic search, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I'm always wrestling with that of like, okay, did I give that enough time? Did I close too quickly? You know what I mean? Do I need to explore some more? Sometimes I'm thinking the opposite. Sometimes I'm like, man, am I just kind of wishy-washy on this because I don't want to XYZ? I don't know.
Yeah.
Or that if I do, it might judge my own life in a particular way. That's usually probably the last couple conversations. I feel like if I actually make a decision here, then I'll have to change my life, and I just simply don't want to do that. I felt that before. So I would say that, and yeah, it's such an interesting conversation though. And I do appreciate the people that are doing it honestly. Like I feel like you ask questions honestly. It's just, there's something about that, DNA that I think it allows for a real conversation to actually happen rather than just, the annoying like Facebook conversations come to life that a lot of people are having these days. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the intent of why I ask questions or why I talk to guys like you is because like I am just so genuinely curious, and it also gives me anxiety to like not be one or the other, or to constantly be searching. And so the goal to me is to hopefully, maybe before I have kids, to at least have some sort of hard line or conviction, or like, you know what, this is what I believe, and this is what, because it's hard to build a story when you don't know the story. And I can't build mythology if I don't have my own mythology. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the thing that really, because it sounds like it's a very similar journey to me, again, not too long ago, but years ago. And the thing that really helped me is I would get a little mystical by saying this, but I would say it was almost Jesus kind of telling me to like focus on him, meaning like, because if I start going, well, what about the violence in the Old Testament? What about all this? And he's like, we can deal with that, but like start with me, meaning like, have you dealt with kind of the thing that matters the most? You know what I mean? And for me, that was a real big collision moment in my life, that it was actually like, okay, I do need to decide, you know what I mean? How I see him, if I, disagree him, if I'm going to submit to his lordship, do I believe that he has a vision for life that is better than mine and better than anything else I can find? And then once I step into that, then we can deal with those other problematic things. Because I think sometimes we do the reverse, and it sometimes can just feel kind of chaotic and distracting, meaning like, I even though I think maybe the violence in the Old Testament, as an example, is a problematic issue, I would hope that my life isn't going to go one way or the other based on what answer that would be, right?
Sure.
Now, do I have an answer on it? Sure, but you know what I mean. So I think to me, it's like the claims, and back to what you were saying too of the way it kind of the disorienting nature of it, maybe is a word for it. All the questions and not knowing where to land. That's actually what I love about Jesus is, he blew up every single person's construct in the first century. So everyone he communicated with was not able to have a construct to fit him, right? So the people that loved him, someone like Peter, if you're familiar with the story, someone like John, some of these other people, right? They loved him, but they did not have a construct for the true him. So they made him in more to like, violent warrior. They wanted him to literally go kill Rome. They wanted him to take up arms, take up weapons, and go kind of kill, the oppressors. Now, does that sound like anyone in the 21st century? Sounds a little bit like it to me. And then you get people on the other side that hated him. hated him. But again, they had no they were not able to fit him into a construct with their hate. And then you got people that maybe were indifferent. You got people that ask questions about, there's so many different stories in there. To me, that's the most fascinating part of like, oh, this man was so fascinating, intriguing, and unique. I'm going to like let all my questions and all my buzziness over here terminate on this first, and then I'll deal with like the ramifications. And I actually am deeply encouraged by like, oh yeah, he disoriented everyone. And so that actually severely encourages me, because I feel like sometimes when I'm disoriented with those questions, I can think I start getting fearful or anxious about it. When I'm like, oh man, he just kind of blew up every last little, possibility.
Yeah, it's nice to like not feel alone in that. I think a lot of times,
Totally.
and a lot of my qualms with church or big C Christianity or whatever, and this is all me stuff. It has nothing to do with them. Is the inability to ask questions, or the inability, like Jerry and I talk about this all the time. My frustration was I would go to youth group and I'd be like, hey, I have a really big question. I'd be like, all right, buddy, I'm going to talk to you right after the thing. And then they just wouldn't, because they didn't have the answer or whatever, which is fine. I just wanted somebody to come down to my level and go, isn't this crazy? This is a lot, huh? Just that solidarity there. I just didn't
100%.
feel. So even you talking about that feels like a breath out and exhale, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, it is sad. There's a level of inauthenticity in the institutionalized church that can really discourage me, and it gets really annoying.
Yeah.
There's a level of, I think, power dynamics that are also at play a lot of times in regards to, I forget the quote, but it's basically like, a certain, I'm not even trying, but basically like you can't make someone see what they're almost paid to not see. If that makes sense. It's like a version of that, but it's like with some vocation. I can't remember the quote. So like there's a level of that's true. Like there's a level of power dynamics of self-preservation, rather than like, man, if I feel like if this is the right answer, then it's okay if it, falls apart or whatever. I just think, I wish there was more of that posturing, a little bit different posturing. Now there is, not to, go, like that's the whole global church. There's massive, beautiful pockets of people answering those questions, trying to reimagine, redo, trying to hold on to orthodoxy, hold on to certain things while, being like, hey, we live in this moment. There's so many different versions, but so I would honor all the traditions, but that part does bother me when people kind of just have that spirit of like, we don't care, or we don't know, or we're paid to not know, and so just be quiet.
Yeah. No, I love that, man. I've taken up so much of your time, and I've loved getting to chat with you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to let you get back to the kiddos and building Legos and all the stuff.
Dude, that's right. They're all up there. If people are watching on videos, my sets.
Yeah, baby. All right, my last question, and it's selfish, is what is your number one tip for a guy like myself, pre-girlfriend, wife, kids? What is the number one thing that you would encourage me to seek after, or to keep building, or to avoid in this season of life, taking back my family that I don't have yet?
Yep. Great question. I would say learn to rule yourself. Learn to master yourself. And most guys can understand that, or at least take that in first physically. And like in like the weight room or food or whatever. Sure. I mean like your proclivities and appetites that can cause destruction and can burn the house down. I think there's a natural flow to life that you see in kind of ancient literature. I can't remember where I read it, but it was like Eastern or Western spiritual something. one of those, I just named the whole world. One of those two. And it was basically this order of a man. Now, again, this might sound a little patriarchal depending on your audience, but I think we can still take something from it. The order of maturity and the order of essentially is, I think it was actually about kingship. So the order of how to become a good king is learn to rule yourself first, then learn to rule your family with your wife. You know what I mean? And all. By the way, again, this shows you, by the way, how damaging our culture is, where rule can be a good word. It's just we've seen it so badly that we always think it means oppressive, dark, hurtful, whatever. Rule can literally, like rule as a king just means to like bring flourishing to the domain that's like in your borders, right? Yeah. We know that from whether it's movies or whatever. We know that like good, gracious kings rule in a way that like everyone gets rich. Not, rich, but like everyone gets rich emotionally, spiritually, physically. Right. Like it's just everyone's thriving, okay? So learn to rule yourself. Then learn to rule your family, then learn to rule your neighborhood, then learn to rule your city. And I think most men, almost every single man, take even like the famous ones the last couple of years, in their 50s and 60s that look like they have a lot of power, look like they're kings, and then just destroy their life, right? Whether it's Christian people in regards to like Carl Lentz or Ravi Zacharias, whether it's culture like Harvey Weinstein, whatever it is. In my opinion, that's just actually those guys that they missed a step back here and then they decided to keep going. Meaning they're trying to still go down that order when they failed on it. Do not move on until you succeed. Do not move on until you learn. So do not go to the family one until you learn to master yourself. Do not go to the neighborhood one until you learn to master your family. Rule your family. And don't move on to the city one, being a large level leader until you've learned to rule all the rest. And I think what that comes down to is man, that's what I would say, is that I think so many men, specifically in my peer level groups, 30s, young 20s, they start jumping into that family one when themselves is not mastered. They have not ruled over their own appetites, desires, and proclivities in a way that can allow them to healthily move on to the next level, but they just selfishly want the next level, and so they leapfrog. And I just think that's a recipe for destruction and hurt and pain. So that's what I would say. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a good question.
That's a great answer, man. I love that. And I appreciate you. And it's been just very fun to just watch you and your family. I am so invested in what you guys do, and it gives me just a lot of hope as a single guy who's looking to have a family. And that's kind of one of my bigger dreams in life, is to see, like, every time I watch your stories, I'm like, that's exactly the kind of feeling I hope that I have, is that, like, that team feeling, and you're building it. And I think your teaching and your leadership doing it is just really special, man. So we love you. We appreciate you. Thanks for coming on.
Dude, same. Thanks for having me. Keep putting out those bangers. I'll keep watching you on TikTok, on Instagram. What was the last one that you put out that's just crushing? Made? Made?
Yeah, there you go.
That's all I know. I just know but I got the tune, and I'm always just like, I basically hop in on that one word every time I listen, and then I'm out. But I kind of know the tune. But I'm getting there. But no, You're amazing. Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Thanks, man.